Ukraine has been rather successful in using its own drones to destroy major ammunition storage sites quite deep within Russia, and they are continuing to do so. Ukraine argues that they could do even better with Western supplied missiles, but using their own weapons, they've made quite a bit of success, and that does limit the ability of Russia to get supplies to its own front line. It increases the costs and complexity of doing so.
Russia has been making progress along some of Ukraine's front lines. What do you make of this? What's your current analysis of it?
You know, the front line in Ukraine has been more or less static for almost 2 years now. Russia does have the momentum to some extent in the Donbass, and there's a potential for it making more advance, but it hasn't done so far. And therefore we shouldn't assume that it will. Winter is coming, which will make it more difficult for both sides to operate, certainly for either side to go on the offensive. And the attrition of Russian personnel and equipment is also very considerable. But I think it is true to say that a war of attrition in the long term is probably not in Ukraine's interest, most of all because of a shortage of personnel, and Russia may be banking on that.
Could you elaborate on that point about Russian equipment? What do we know so far about its current supply? Could you elaborate on that?
Well, in particular, Russia is going through its armoured vehicles and its artillery barrels at a very considerable rate. And from what we know about Russian production, they're not able to produce enough to keep their stock constant. So their stock of key elements in their ground forces is continuing to decline. Now, they're making up for that to some extent with supplies from elsewhere, from Iran and North Korea in particular, but so far there haven't been large-scale Chinese supplies which would be transformative, but that hasn't happened. So Russia has shortages of its own. Of course, Ukraine has many shortages also, because as Ukraine has run down its stocks of old Soviet equipment, it's become increasingly reliant on supplies from Western allies and also from its own production, and there's a lot of concern there. I think the other element in this war of attrition which we need to watch very carefully is Russia has been pretty successful this year in attacking Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and if they make much more progress in that, we could see large-scale power cuts in Ukraine, which will affect the civilian population, but it may also affect Ukraine's ability to sustain its defense production.
On Sunday, we saw that Ukraine had wide-scale attacks with drones in Russia, supposedly also including a place that included Iranian supplies, allegedly. What do we know so far about that? Is there any confirmation about that it actually included Iranian supply?
Ukraine has been rather successful in using its own drones to destroy major ammunition storage sites quite deep within Russia, and they are continuing to do so. Ukraine argues that they could do even better with Western supplied missiles, but using their own weapons, they've made quite a bit of success, and that does limit the ability of Russia to get supplies to its own front line. It increases the costs and complexity of doing so. It isn't, I think, in itself transformative, but it does make a difference. And the fact that Ukraine does now possess some Russian territory in Kursk, quite a significant amount of Russian territory, does provide an additional location from which some of those drones could be launched, which is one of the perhaps under-noticed elements of that particular offensive.
And we saw last week Zelensky, he went to the US to present his victory plan. We don't know the full details about that, but do you think it's fair to say that he didn't have the outcome they expected from that?
There's been a lot of publicity given to this question of supplying, of giving Ukraine permission to use weapons they already have from the West against a wider range of targets within Russia. President Biden is clearly reluctant to do so because he feels that there are some risks of escalation involved, which he's not willing to bear. Ukraine keeps pushing for that. I'm skeptical as to whether this particular permission for this particular weapon system would be transformative. It would help, and there are some potential targets in Russia which it's not easy for the Russians to move, But Russia has been preparing for the possibility of the deployment of these weapons and relocating its assets accordingly. So over the last 2 years, we've had one debate after another about magic weapons, and we all remember that very intense debate about F-16s. Well, Ukraine has F-16s in service now. They help, but they're not transforming the situation, and these weapons, I don't think, will either.
We're at the Conservative Party conference at the moment. They're now in opposition following the general election. How do you see the coverage of Ukraine at this conference in comparison to the Labour conference last week and also the government's stance on these long-range missiles?
One of the most impressive things about UK politics towards Ukraine is that there's a broad cross-party consensus, particularly between the Labour and Conservative parties, in support of the policy. So there really hasn't been any change in policy towards Ukraine since Labour came to power compared with the last government. And of course, party leaders inevitably snipe at each other at the margins, but on this particular aspect of UK policy, the level of support, the type of support is pretty much the same under this government compared with the last government. I think Labour is rather less critical openly of our European allies than the last Conservative government, but they probably have more or less the same approach in private. But that's a matter of tactics. And it's in stark contrast with many of our major allies. If you look at the United States, there's a deep division based on party lines on attitudes towards Ukraine. The American presidential election could make a real difference to Ukraine in a way which the British election has not made a difference. And if you look at France or Germany or Netherlands, Hungary, the recent elections in Austria, a whole range of our European allies do have quite vigorous domestic debates as to whether or not we should be supporting Ukraine to the extent we have done it. And that's certainly not the case here.
With Zelensky's visit to the US, it was reported that he potentially riled up a few senior Republicans, including Trump. As you mentioned, we've got the US election coming up. If Trump was to win, how do we see that relationship between Zelensky and Trump? Do we see it, are things moving forward or moving backwards?
It's very difficult to predict what Trump will do, not least because what he says is entirely unrealistic. He will not solve the Ukraine problem. He will not impose a peace deal. He does not have the capacity, the American does not have the capacity to impose a peace deal in Ukraine on day one. The lever America does have is whether or not to turn off the tap of military aid to Ukraine. And from what Trump has been saying, there is a concern on Zelensky's part that he will do so. But I don't think that's inevitable. If a Trump presidency was to turn off the tap of Ukrainian aid and Ukraine had to rely entirely on European aid, then there would be a very considerable risk that Russia would take a lot more territory and force a peace deal which would be very much to Ukraine's disadvantage, which would, I think, have a wider impact on NATO. It would a wider impact on the extent to which European countries, including ourselves, felt we could rely on the United States to come to the defense of Poland or Sweden or indeed the United Kingdom. Is that really what President Trump wants? A President Trump would want? It's not clear. I think that the problem with thinking about a peace deal in current circumstances is not only about Ukraine, or it's not mainly about Ukraine wanting to get all its territory back plus Crimea, which is quite unrealistic in current circumstances. It's about why should President Putin, in a situation where he may feel time is on his side, why should he do a deal now on terms which would be in any way acceptable to Ukraine? And the one scenario which is being talked about quite a bit is one in which Ukraine would accept a ceasefire more or less where the forces are now, not a permanent settlement, but a ceasefire which could become permanent, in return for a NATO security guarantee to free Ukraine. The problem with that is that key Western countries, most of all the United States, right now, under this presidency, and I think also under a Trump presidency, would not be prepared to give that guarantee, which would inevitably involve American troops on the ground in Kharkiv, in Kiev, in Odessa, along that contested front line. That's not a commitment, for better or for worse, that it seems to me the United States is prepared to make. And it's very hard to imagine that the UK or any European country would be prepared to make that credible threat of going to war with Russia in defense of Ukraine without the Americans also making that commitment. So if that option is off the table, then we're in for a really rocky few months ahead. We've got a war of attrition. There are reasons to argue for Ukraine losing that war of attrition, but there are also reasons to argue that Russia is running out of resources as well. And I'm not a betting man, I don't know how that will go, but the next few months are key. And certainly a President Trump coming into office, raising real questions about American support to Ukraine without being able to broker a peace deal will be a moment of existential danger, I think, Ukraine. A collapse of confidence cannot be ruled out, and that's a moment which is a sort of moment for which Putin has been preparing for the last 2 years.
We have seen an amping up in rhetoric about nuclear threats as well. Is this again empty threats, or is there something a bit more substantial there?
You know, I think we have to take the fact that Russia is a nuclear weapons state seriously. The moment at which American intelligence analysts thought the threat was greatest was in the autumn of 2022, when Ukraine was making very substantial gains on the ground, retaking a lot of the territory which Russia had gained. And I think it's in a scenario of Russian military collapse and Russian retreat where you begin to think Russian nuclear threats, not necessarily Russian nuclear use, but more credible Russian nuclear threats have to be taken seriously. Now, I think at that time, the United States, along with the UK and other NATO countries, made it pretty clear to Russia that if they were to use a nuclear weapon, even one weapon in a demonstrative way over the Black Sea or something, then that could well trigger very strong NATO conventional retaliation, attacking Russian ships, Russian ground forces in a way which would really disadvantage Russia's position on the ground. And that didn't materialize, the Russian front line stabilized, and since then I think the threats have been less credible. But we cannot rule them out. We have to be careful. The Americans are quite right in taking this threat seriously because it could re-emerge. It's also the case that Russia has other escalatory threats that it could pursue. It could, for example, target some of the undersea cables which are vital for the operation of our internet. They've already said Ukraine attacked the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Germany and Russia, which we think they probably did. Could Russia do the similar and see what our response would be? Could they supply more sophisticated weapons to the Houthis in Yemen and see what their response from Western powers would be? I don't know. We shouldn't think Russia doesn't have other elements in its arsenal. Right now, both sides have contained the Ukrainian war in a way which is to the disadvantage of the Ukrainians, but is to the advantage of both Russia and NATO that they haven't got into a full-scale war with each other. But as long as this conflict in Ukraine continues, that's a real risk which has to be taken seriously.
You know, this conflict, it was one that was believed to be over within a few days, wasn't it? And here we are, years later. What do you make of this winter coming up? How do you see things progressing? It's
very hard to predict what's going to happen next. Russia clearly wants to get itself into a situation by the end of the winter when the new president comes in, where it's in a position of advancing, of real advantage. It may, in those circumstances, be prepared to do a deal on its terms. But Russia's terms right now, particularly if it's on the front foot, would involve President Zelensky going and being replaced by a more pliant figure. It would involve the prospect of Ukraine joining NATO going out the window. It would involve a Ukraine which might still, in part of its territory, be nominally independent, but it would in practice have to, at the very least, pay due heed to the policy of those in the Kremlin. And it would probably leave Russia with the potential for restarting the war at any time. So that's not when it was in its advantage to do so. So much worse than the deal Ukraine had in 2014, for example.
I guess that does depend on a Trump win, doesn't it? And we're seeing that, Harris is also looking incredibly popular. If she does win at the election, what do you see things playing out in that terms?
It's important to remember that American military aid to Ukraine does not only depend on who's in the White House, it also depends on who's in control of Congress. And what we saw at the beginning of this year was several months in which Biden was pushing for aid to Ukraine on a large scale, and it was being blocked by the Republicans in the House of Representatives. So even if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, if the Republicans maintain control of the House, that's entirely possible, encouraged by an embittered Donald Trump, that the House will not allow any further military aid to Ukraine, as they did earlier this year. In those circumstances, everything I've just said in terms of Putin pushing for a settlement on his terms would apply. And, Ukrainians are tired about 2 years of war. They're remarkably united so far. But if they have a winter with very little heat, if many more people flee the country, and if Russia continues to have gains, even incremental gains on the ground, then we're in a pretty dangerous situation. And we, as European allies of the United States, will have to step up more. And I think it's going to be a big challenge for the British government, but also for the German government, the French government, other key NATO allies. Are we prepared to step in and do more to support Ukraine if the United States, for whatever reason, is backing off?